Greetings and welcome back to another edition of MGTOW Talks. A special guest with me today. Well, you know him, the one and all, Teal Deer, the miraculous cervid. And we're going to be talking about, I guess, some pretty controversial stuff, or I guess depends on what your point of view is, but the many recent happenings in the United States, say with Black Lives Matter, racial tension, some of the ongoing issues in Europe between certain Muslim populations, and the sort of resistance on the part of a lot of people to want to investigate the origin of these things and want to understand it for fear of perhaps somewhat justifiable fear of it perhaps leading down a dark pathway or what have you. Now, I'll introduce the topic first by mentioning a conversation that a former NYPD detective had with I believe he was a BML activist or someone at the very least who feels some kind of kinship with Black Lives Matter on national television, CNN. The police detective said upwards of 75% of violent crimes are committed by blacks. He even did use the term blacks are prone. And immediately the guy was jumping in his face, screaming at him. Many of you might be familiar with that clip. And my first reaction was, okay, you can dissect the language, prone, whatever, but those stats seem to be accurate. I looked them up, and they seem to be accurate in most places in the United States, particularly urban areas. So the first thing I thought of was, well, wait, you're not going to talk about the data? You're just going to scream at him? I'm wondering, as we begin this conversation, what your thoughts on that kind of I'll scream in your face approach are, Teal dear.
Oh, race war when? That seems to be where this is going, frankly. People do not want to engage with the data. They don't want to engage with the literature. They don't want to talk about it. They don't want to think about it. People just want to get violent about it, which there seems to be only one outcome of this, which is extreme violence. Is it any wonder that this is what we're seeing? People don't want to understand it. They just want to stamp it into the dirt and not have to listen to it. It's kind of like, instead of sticking their own head in the sand, they'd rather stick someone else's head in the sand, and that's the facts and figures, violently, with a boot on the back of the neck.
Well, it's Sam Harris who's frequently said this, that, ultimately there's just two choices you have with very few, there's not much in between. You have conversation and violence. And in some sense, the way that Black Lives activist was screaming at this former police officer, I mean, literally a hair's breadth away from his face. I mean, was it violence in the traditional sense? No, but it really was veering away from the dimension of conversation and moving more towards that sort of violent dimension. And I see all this is sort of coming to a head, I think, everywhere, not just in the United States, but also in relation to things happening in Europe. And most recently, in light of my fairly recent video on consanguinity, where I talked about a bit about genetics and inbreeding and what have you. There weren't many of these comments, but a few comments claiming I was a scientific racist, a supremacist of some sort. Not a single one of them addressed the data I talked about, and one could only assume that they were in some sort of tacit agreement against the data, which is to say they somehow supported cousins fucking each other and reproducing. I don't really know, but I see this a lot, and it's interesting in the so-called MGTOW community. It's not really a community. It also, even there, it seems it's all well and good to talk about every sex difference imaginable under the sun. But if you want to talk about possibilities of different genetic populations that are almost always somehow interwoven with the culture environment as well, but nonetheless, it's a combination of these things. People get really irate and start calling you names. So on every side of things, in every spectrum of community, there seems to be a resistance to some type of analysis. It just, it depends on who you're analyzing or who you're, looking at the data for. And my thing is that, look, we have a lot of problems that are ongoing in the world, and perhaps we're living in a critical juncture in history. I don't know. A lot of people feel that way. I think we are in some sense. And so if we shy away from the data, recoil, whether it's talking about, the difference between men and women on a biological level, and the fact that genetic populations that have lived for millennia in relative isolation might have some differences. We just can't ignore that, or else the questions will go forever unanswered, whether there are specific answers or not. But we have to make an effort. That's my view.
Yeah, I'm completely on board with this. I know we've spoken about this before. I believe this was our very first conversation, the topic of delicious forbidden knowledge.
Yeah.
The idea that there are some things that you are just not allowed to talk about, and yet we're going to.
But this
right
is
now.
a Teal, this is a real phenomenon in academia. Someone happily posted a link a while back. Now I remember this. I think his name is Bruce Chan. He's a Chinese American researcher at the University of Chicago who just gave up his research because it seemed at the time, I think he just gave it up, so we don't know what became of it, that there were some differences in the genetic development in certain genes related to cognition between, I guess, Asians, Europeans, and sub-Saharan Africans. And this huge controversy, and he literally said at the time, if I recall it, well, some things are just better off. We're better off just not knowing certain things, and and I see this as well. And once again, among MGTOW and just pretty much about it, the normal population, whether it's comes down to men and women or blacks and whites or whatever. We're at a point now where I think we have to investigate this stuff because it's becoming so frequent. Many in the audience might have heard about the most recent violent attack in Munich. We don't have that much data on it, apart from a few things. He was 18. He was the son of Iranian asylum seekers, and he probably had some sort of psychosis, killed about 10 people, injured a bunch of others. What explains this? Well, you can offer different hypotheses. And one of the hypotheses I offered in the consanguinity video was that maybe the extreme rates of inbreeding in some of these societies and cultures contributes not only to physical health problems, we know it also has an effect, potentially at least, on mental health, and can lead to criminality, among other things. And this was deemed scientific racism. So
I know, it's really bizarre that someone would take that attitude towards it. Because the fundamental point of that video, or at least what I took away from it ultimately, was inbreeding causes problems. We know this. If you have a lot of inbreeding, that will cause a lot more problems. If you have one particular geographical area where there is a lot of inbreeding, that particular geographical area will have a lot of the associated problems with inbreeding. That doesn't really seem controversial or weird or racist or bigoted in any way, because that model of understanding can be applied to any population. You could do that with a population of mice in a lab. Just inbreed them and inbreed them and inbreed them, and within about 5 or 6 generations, you're going to have a load of problems, not only physical, but also with just mental cognition and their ability to understand and function and interact. Well, indeed, that was one of the things that started happening towards the end of the Mouse Utopia experiment, where there were instances of inbreeding because of the limited population.
Yeah, and I mean, in the United States, it's been pretty well studied. The Amish population, very isolated, it's living in their own dimension. Tons of problems, health problems from A to Z. Kind of obvious. So the inbreeding thing wasn't specific, and it's a practice that's very common in areas of the world that happen to have quote unquote brown skinned people. But in as much as it's a phenomenon that's negative, it applies across the board to all genetic populations. You get too much inbreeding, and it's a bad thing. It's even, and I suppose people took some issue with the fact that it's actually a problem in the Pakistani Kashmiri community in the UK as well. I mean, when this is brought to their attention, they say, well, Allah or God wills it or what have you. I suppose once you depart from the data and say, well, what are the consequences of this, or what are some considerations? To me, this is bad for, say, Western society, because if you have a child with a congenital illness, is going to be permanently retarded or permanently ill, that applies pressure to the healthcare system unnecessarily. They're not going to be contributors to society in any way. And in as much as some of these cases, as I hypothesize, might lead to mental illness and possible criminal activity, such as the case of this young Iranian guy, and we don't know about it. I'm speculating. I mean, he was apparently psychotic. You end up with a lot of dead people. So people might not like to hear it, but in my view, and no one has to agree, Teal does not agree, but we should be very circumspect about these particular populations because they have long traditions of inbreeding that can negatively affect outcomes, not just economically, but behaviorally and consequently criminally.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like a sort of very horrendous thing to say. In essence, sort of reducing people down to genetic stock almost. But you do have to consider that people are the product of their genes. Now, we know via the study of epigenetics, people's genes can express very differently in different environments with different stimuli, all sorts of things like this. The
Yeah.
same gene might express itself in multiple different ways given
That person
multiple
might end
different
up an
environments.
alcoholic in a certain environment and never touch a drop of booze in another. That's entirely
Yeah,
possible.
yeah. There is actually one very good example of that. I believe it's allele 1 and allele 2. Each have components which are both required for you to become an addictive personality. But that's all that gene indicates, which is why you often find people who are addicted to alcohol often are addicted to smoking, addicted to gambling, addicted to X, Y, Z. You often find that someone who has one vice will have many others because of that genetic predisposition to addiction.
Hmm.
Now, if your environment, you can get access to alcohol, drugs, cigarettes,
Hmm.
gambling, prostitution, all of these things, you can be addicted to any number or all of those things. But if you're in an environment where, say, the only thing you can get addicted to is, I believe it's somewhere in South Asia, nicotine. It's like the only substance that they have. But all of the addicts out there, they just take massive plugs of this stuff. It's like Play-Doh or clay and just
Hmm.
shove it in their gums. And they're just addicted to it. But some of them don't touch it. But some of them who do get it, that is the only thing they have to be addicted to. So they're addicted to that.
Yeah, and I mean, this is just a working hypothesis. I mean, obviously, it would take real researchers to investigate this further. Throughout continental Europe, in particular, if you look at statistics from, say, the Dutch government and the German government, and Dr. Lehman, actually, if those of you familiar with him, he's a sociologist. Actually, he put out some of these stats. These populations are still smaller than the native European populations, and yet disproportionately they commit far greater degree of the crimes, violent crimes, than the natives. And I think that kind of phenomenon begs an explanation. Now, is my explanation correct? Well, I don't think we know yet, but it's something that's possible given what we know about inbreeding and its effect on cognition and behavior. And that's pretty much all that video was about. I'm hypothesizing about what might be a principal cause, or at least one major cause among several others. No doubt, Islam itself is a fantastic epigenetic tool for turning people into raving madmen, but that's kind of obvious by now to most people.
Yeah, if you have a predisposition towards, I don't know, insanity, then religion certainly seems to be a common trait between those sorts of people. Islam is very good at hijacking that and turning it into, turning people into mass murder machines, it seems.
Yeah, and as I said, it seems across the board that people are just reluctant to look at this stuff, whether it's MGTOW people, mainstream people. We were talking briefly earlier. Sargon of Akkad, he put out this video, and he was more than willing to state, in the context of the United States, that blacks commit the overwhelming majority of violent crime, and at the same time they're a smaller population percentage-wise than whites. And that's all well and good, but his hypothesis seemed to be just the system, which to me seemed eerily similar to something that Black Lives Matter was. Well, it's the system, it's the white man or whatever.
It was the poverty argument. It just kind of stopped there. It's like the problem with like the black community is, or his point was, it's all poverty. It's like, okay, So are you saying the man is keeping the black man down? No, we need a slightly better explanation for why the black community, and I fucking hate that term because it basically
Yeah,
turns black people into a blob, which they're
well,
not.
I don't even like the term community at all. I mean, I don't like it for MGTOW. I don't like it for Overwatch. I mean, it gives us off this notion of some sort of semi-harmonious unit that sort of gets along and collaborates with each other. I mean, tons of MGTOW hate each other. That's why I just don't want. I refuse to use it. But yeah, I mean, this is. I think this there's a kind of political angle to using that term. People, I think, intentionally use it because from a propagandistic point of view, it implies the notion of unity. If you talk about a black community, implied in that is that all blacks somehow have loyalty to this, or should at least. There's a YouTuber named Tommy Sotomayor who's kind of famous for going off on black women and talking about problems in the so-called black community. And it, you know, to me, it's a bit transparent. It's sort of meant to sort of suck people in. I have a number of black subs. I have a few of them. They grew up in some pretty impoverished circumstances. That left the ghetto. I mean, I've never had conversations with most of them, but I think I can't imagine most of them would get terribly involved in this political term of the black community. They're just sort of getting on with their lives. So I think it's a political tool. It's why BML, BL, whatever the fuck, Black Lives Matter uses it. It's why all of these ethnic groups and religious groups use it. It's to promote a sort of false sense of harmony where there is perhaps very little or even none in some cases.
It is a kind of artificial form of in-group out-group preference. That's what I see it as. It just simply turns it just creates an in-group, it creates an out-group, and that is one of the biggest problems that we have at the moment. I mean, I've even covered this in a recent video where I talked about implicit bias and police racism, and the biggest indicator of when people are going to give someone preferential treatment or non-preferential treatment is when they are considered to be part of the in-group or part of the out-group. But you can manufacture in-groups or out-groups, and you can manufacture it on the most arbitrary of criteria. You can just literally say to someone, you're in this group now, and that's all it takes. Just literally, you're in group A, you're in group B. Okay, off you go. And people will treat each other differently based on just someone saying, you're in this group, you're in that group.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, maybe the funniest, and maybe it's not that funny, or most ludicrous one. There is literal hostility sometimes between so-called console players and PC players. Right? The PC community, the console community, the PlayStation community. I joke around about PC master races, whatever, but I mean, you can that's a perfect example of someone who manufactured something, and you'll literally get people arguing, hundreds of comments about just, what scumbags console players are, what elitist PC players are, etc. Two quote unquote communities that really have, I mean, these people aren't in communities. They're just individuals who own PCs and consoles, but it creates this sort of false sense of unity. And I suppose, and it's interesting in my exploration of the alt-right, I've noticed this too, and they admit to this, that even though the term white is poorly defined, because there are different kinds of white people. I'm an almost entirely Eastern European white person versus, say, a Northwestern one or whatever. They use the term white because it politically comes across as a sort of unifying a unifying title that people can feel they can unite under, quote unquote white people. Never mind the hostility shown to the Polish workers in the UK who are pretty pale themselves. But so it's I think it's a useful tool if your goal is political propaganda and artificially creating alliances. But without it, I think a lot of people would. I mean, you still get a lot of tribalism and in-group, out-group, but most people still would. I think some sizable number of people wouldn't look at these things in terms of group A and B possibly.
Well, we could hope that we could get rid of this sort of thing, but apparently we can't. It's tribalism seems to be something that's basically hardwired into the human brain.
Well, that's the alt-right's argument, right? I mean, you follow them a bit. You find them interesting or fascinating at the very least. I mean,
yeah, they are the only community that really sort of touches on this, and it shouldn't be surprising to anyone that humans, being primates, have a tribalist us and them mentality, because that's something that basically every single ape exhibits to some degree. And I know people are going to do the bonobos argument. Have you ever seen two different troops of bonobos meeting each other? It's not too friendly.
Mm.
They're all very egalitarian and lovey-dovey in their own groups, but when the two different groups meet, there can be hostilities, there can be frictions. That's life. This is the genetic inheritance of humans. It is my group, your group. It seems to be something that's never going to go away. It's part of sort of a, I don't like the term natural order because that brings up all sorts of other connotations, but it seems to be something that we're going to sort of never be able to get rid of. We're just going to have to kind of play around it, almost as with so many other things in genetics. And I think that's one of the reasons why I do like the alt-right quite a bit, because they are actually willing to look at some of
Teal
these
Deer
sorts of
triggered. Teal Deer, you said you'd like the alt-right quite a bit. Triggered.
I know it's
Build me
that's
alt-right
it.
liker person.
Yep, that's it. People unsubscribe, hate you, hate mail, and all of that sort of nonsense. If you wish to call me a Nazi or some such bullshit, send your hate mail to @Sargon of a card.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and I think their argument, I guess, would be, because it's so ingrained and endemic from a genetic basis upwards, you have no choice but to work with it. Um, but it's undeniable that at the same time, tribalism can be incredibly destructive. It can be beneficial to the in-group, but incredibly destructive when you're thinking of larger populations. Um, so much of the world has changed, and we didn't evolve to live in these gigantic communities and what have you. And I'm perfectly willing to concede that it being natural, but the idea that society will eternally have to be structured around group A and B and C and D, etc., forever until the sun burns out. I it's not that it just doesn't sit well with me because I'm some sort of idealist, and I guess I am a bit, but it just that doesn't strike me as the path forward if we want to advance as a species. Yeah.
Yeah, I can sort of see what you mean with that. It's if we're going to constantly have our differences, is it, are we ever going to be able to get anywhere? But I would say that we will, because a lot of greatness has been born from controlling the in-group, out-group. I mean, look at something like the Olympic Games or any sort of competitive sport.
Yeah.
A lot of these people, yeah, as soon as they're in the ring, on the track, whatever, they're competitors. But outside of that, they don't have to be.
Oh yeah, I mean, generally speaking, in professional sports, there's some degree of sportsmanship. Yeah, I guess the more problematic is the issue of ethnic and religious communities. It's not so easily uh, blanketed under the fold of say sportsmanship in the Olympics or basketball teams. It's a trickier issue, and it is of course the alt-right's obsession, I suppose. But one I think that because of its prevalence and the fact that it's there, and apropos, C.S. MGTOW gets a lot of flack for being critical of Nigeria as a country, called an Uncle Tom, all sorts of things. And just recently, we didn't even know this, but apparently, depending on the region, but on aggregate, Nigeria has the highest rate of kidnapping in the world, a dubious honor, I suppose. And he'll point something like that out, and people will just go apeshit on him. Uh, this is the problem: is that when your loyalty to your tribe supersedes the desire for accurate data and the willingness to address certain problems within a quote unquote community, whatever that means, or a nation, even if you want to put it in those terms, because then you're purposely shutting your eyes and plugging up your ears because it doesn't sit well. And I think that's to some extent what's happened with some MGTOW's animosity towards me, at least, because I broken some holy rule where we pretend, I don't know, that everyone is the same. Women and men are different, but everyone in every other regard, everyone's the same. I think it's not too dissimilar there. But once again, how can we press forward as a species in any of our inquiries if we stop ourselves from investigating? It just doesn't compute with me. It doesn't make any sense. I don't have any ulterior motive other than trying to understand something because I observe something. I think that's similar with you. It's similar with a lot of people. We see all, this incident in Nice, France, where the guy drove a lorry into these people. He had a documented history of mental illness, for example. Where did that come from? Well, maybe he was inbred. I don't know. Possibly. Thinking about these things makes people uncomfortable, but someone has to do it. Because I think if we don't, there are two outcomes. Maybe we'll get both. We'll get stuck in this perpetual vicious circle that we're in right now, where Sargon, for example, puts out a video about whatever, poverty and the system, and other people just screaming down police officers about statistics because stats are racist and whatever. And the worst of the case scenario, as we talked about at the outset, is, well, just violence. People are just going to go at each other because we can't have a civil conversation about data that might make people feel queasy and uncomfortable. But I really think this is critical because it's so important to discuss these things, if only because they're so relevant. Yeah.
So let's do that then. Let's just get straight on into this, because
all right, fair enough. Yeah.
Fuck political correctness.
All right.
I do not care, not
all
even
right.
a little bit.
We will abandon all tenets of political correctness from here on. It's out there. We've thrown it in the trash bin.
Consider this to be your trigger warning. It has been an honor to play with you tonight, gentlemen.
Yeah.
So on and so forth. Let's go. We're not even just going to try and bypass the iceberg. We're going to go straight into it because fuck it. Let's talk about populations and intelligence because this is the real contentious point that everyone wants to ignore. Why is it in every single measurement that we have of intelligence, IQ being the most indicative of everything? Now, I'm well aware of the fact that IQ is not the only measure of intelligence that we have.
It's part of G, general intelligence.
Yeah, but IQ is always the best indicator of all of the other categories. So you can take IQ, and from that, you can predict to a reasonable degree of accuracy what all of the other components are going to be. But you can't necessarily do that with all of the other components. So the question then becomes, why are certain populations, and I'm going to say populations here because I'm going to ignore the fucking pseudoscience race term, because that's bullshit, as we all know.
I'm curious, though. I mean, I don't but Coltane mentioned this. I mean, he feels that it's just sort of semantics. I'm just curious myself. I'd agree with you. I mean, it's more accurate to talk about genetic populations, but why do you feel that the term race itself is bullshit? It might be, illuminating to hear that.
Because race doesn't exist in biology. Genetic populations do.
Right.
Race is the kind of superfluous, what do you look like? You have black people. Okay, which black people? Yeah. East African black people, West African black people, Caribbean black people, South Pacific black people. I mean, these are all people who could be considered black. But Pacific Island black people are a totally genetically unique population compared to African black people.
So it's safe to say that race is a political term.
I think. Race is the political term, and it's sorely lacking compared to genetic populations.
Yeah.
So that's why why is it? And this is why, to come back to the point, why are certain genetic populations always, on average, higher or lower than other genetic populations when we test for IQ? Now, IQ, as we know, has been linked to everything else to a reasonable degree of accuracy. It's been linked to general prosperity. It's been linked to the ability to acquire wealth. It's been linked to career success, school success, all of these things are linked to it. It is pretty much objectively, the higher the IQ, the better you're going to do. Pretty much with very few exceptions.
And the map that was displayed on that video, where IQ correlated with a few exceptions, like oil-rich Middle East, whatever, pretty much perfectly. The higher IQ, the better GDP per capita, etc.
Yeah,
you had. So
yeah, and this then sort of raises the interesting point. First of all, why do different areas have different average IQs? Second of all, why does IQ correlate almost perfectly with GDP outside of a few
weird exceptions, like
yeah.
Oman having lots of oil?
Yeah, outside of a few
average.
like unique clusters of geographical phenomenon like oil deposits. Outside of that, it's almost a perfect match. So why does this happen? What caused that divide to come about?
That's a really good question.
I think when we start answering those questions, that is when A, things start getting really uncomfortable, but B, it's also when we start actually understanding a lot about how humans evolved. And it's not only about humans, but you can make the same case for pretty much any species. In this regard, you can find examples and models in other species. It's just that we happen to be talking about humans for this. And it's rather interesting that in Africa, the cradle of civilization and the richest continent in the world when it comes to natural resources, is a hellhole for the most part. It's very poor conditions for everyone, very low IQ for pretty much everyone. It's what people always make the argument, well, which came first, the high IQ or the good populate or the good society and whatnot. It's, well, as always, this is a feedback of environment. But why is it when people started moving out from Africa, their IQ began to increase?
Well, I think we can speculate reasonably accurately to some degree, and I've thought about this a lot, and I've heard all sorts of hypotheses. Obviously, the challenges of a new environment will whittle down certain members of a population.
Yeah.
The ones that succeed at dealing with those unique challenges, such as having to deal with, wintering, dealing with months and months of a much colder climate, obviously, presumably, almost as we could assume this, many people died. Many, if the out of Africa hypothesis accepted, I think largely is, in moving up to Europe and other places like Northeast Asia and North in general, climate changed, food availability changed. People had to deal with new challenges. The ones that didn't, they died. They didn't pass on their genes. The ones that did adapted and over time evolved adaptations, including almost certainly better means of cognition and thinking about the environment and how to survive. And I think that much we can safely assume.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because once you move, if you're in an area where you only need to reach standard A, we'll say it's 20% completely arbitrarily of maximum capacity. If that's all you ever need to do in order to survive, it's unsurprising that that's pretty much where all of the species is going to sit. And I'm not talking about humans here. This can be applied to any animal. If you only have to work that hard to survive, that's how hard the average population is going to work, with a few higher, a few lower, obviously. If you then move to another area where you have to reach a higher standard, say 40 or 50% of your maximum outcome, because you have to consider building more advanced shelters. If you're in Africa, well, the weather is pretty constant, hot, sunny. That's basically it. That's all it ever is.
Availability of vegetable matter and fruits is going to be much more constant as well.
Yeah, it's more constant outside of, you do have the rainy season and the dry season in certain areas, but in some of those areas it's a lot more constant. And then when you go out to areas where you have that hot summer, cold winter sort of shift going on, you have to then start engineering new things. You have to start building homes that can both withstand heat and ventilate themselves, or can be ventilated out, but can also withstand rain, can withstand snow, can withstand freezing, thawing.
Yeah, obviously if you're going to run around in a loincloth in, I don't know, like -10 degrees Celsius, you're going to have a problem in the
Yeah.
long term. Yeah.
Yeah, so you have to be able to then fashion more clothes, which means you have to what? You have to be more inventive. Am I going to make it out of plant fibers? Am I going to make it out of animal skins? How am I going to put it all together? These are all things you have then more tools and more things at your disposal. And all of these challenges, the people who are most successful at these, and it's funny how generally the most successful at these are going to be the males because they, I suppose we have to go back to a little bit of the MGTOW thing here. Males are the ones who generally sort of drive the society forward because they are always the ones who have to do the best so that they can acquire the female attention, the female validation that they're ultimately seeking forever onwards, because that's how humans happen to reproduce. It's the general pattern of mate selection within people. So it shouldn't then really come as a surprise that those societies then have those individuals who develop those kinds of technology, those new patterns of ways of doing things, pass on their genes. And it then should not come as a surprise to anyone that societies that have evolved and gone through those environmental changes into those less hospitable areas tend to develop higher IQs. And I know that there are some people who have said it's like, oh, well, what? How do you explain East Asia and things like that, where they live in a really hot climate where everything's really consistent? Okay, if they came out of Africa, where did they have to go? Through and across, oh yeah, Russia, the Himalayas, and all of that shit.
Well, I
That
mean,
was your cold environment.
and to be not to make too fine a point, we're talking about Northeast Asia. The IQ, say in places like Southeast Asian, are not nearly as well. I mean, we're talking about a full standard deviation difference. So we're specifically talking about places like Japan, Korean Peninsula, most parts of China. I mean that it's fairly north there. They have very pronounced seasons, etc. So there actually are observable differences, instead of full standard deviation between say the average IQ in a place like Thailand or Vietnam and the average IQ in a place like Japan or South Korea. Yeah.
Yeah. And this is then where things get really, really awkward for people, because this is then IQ is related to genetics. We know this. This is an inescapable fact. It's depending on what age you are or what tests you hold dearest and nearest to your ideological heart, it can be anywhere from about 40 to about 70%. Generally, it seems to be about 60 to 70, depending on what you're reading. But that seems to be the most sort of accurate way of looking at it. So whether you like it or not, more than half of your intelligence came from your parents. If your parents are smarter than someone else's parents, you're probably going to be smarter than their child. Now, if those populations are in two different areas, again, we have genetically more fit for that environment, which is more intelligent in that circumstance, whereas in the other, it's not. This is then again, this is where people get really, really awkward and they start tensing up. And I have no doubt that there are so many people now in the comments who are just like, "Oh my God, Teal, they're so racist. Fuck you." It's no, this is simple evolution. This is simple survival of the fittest, adapting to your environment.
I always find this puzzling and bewildering because it's kind of obvious why, but you apply it to any other species, and I would argue it's interesting that we can't run IQ tests on say orca populations, but depending on the area of the world, they'll develop very specific cultures of hunting that involve very sophisticated hunting techniques. In some cases, they'll literally beach themselves. They can flip sharks around to induce something called tonic immobility. If we could somehow measure orca intelligence, I bet based on the common prey items. For example, in northwestern Canada, in the United States, off the coast, you have a lot of what we're called resident orcas that just eat fish. I bet those populations are a lot dumber than the ones that have to figure out how to flip over sharks in order to safely consume their livers, etc. I'd be willing to bet a couple of bucks on that, because that's a much more sophisticated hunting technique. I mean, we have no way of measuring it, but I think this could be applied across many intelligent social mammals. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we've already seen things like this even in chimpanzee populations, in areas which have like rich in termites and things like that. They learn how to use sticks and poke them into the termite mounds. Termites bite onto the invading stick, and then they pull it out and just eat all the termites off the stick. Okay, great. Areas where they don't have termite mounds, and areas which have sort of higher proportions of nuts and things like that, chimpanzees learn to use hammers. They learn to use rocks and bash them together to obviously open up the shells and get the nuts from inside. Those are different things. Now, there are areas where those skills are unique to certain families. And again, I wouldn't be surprised if you were to sort of reinforce that, if you were to do IQ tests between those two, because you'll probably find again that the ones who are using more sophisticated tools, such as hammers, and whether you like it or not, the concept of hammer and anvil is more complicated than poke it with a stick.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't be surprised again if you saw an intelligence difference between those populations.
Another great example, teal deer, domesticated dog breeds, of which there are literally hundreds. Over many millennia, they reckon that the first wolves were domesticated about 40,000 years ago, a fairly long time. So, but since then, there's been this constant contact between man and canine. Over the last few millennia, been bred for very specific tasks, and we know, for example, that in herding breeds like the Welsh Corgi, or the Shetland sheepdog, or the Australian cattle dog, etc., that these breeds, on average, display more, at least what we would call the capacity for intelligence, figuring things out, than, say, a bulldog, or what have you. Because the complexity of their task, keeping the herd in line, making sure everything goes well, it's frankly speaking more complicated than fighting another dog is. Just latch onto them. We know this. We know that certain dogs are more receptive to training types of breeds. So it's so obvious in other species, and fairly obvious in humans too, I suppose. But
it's very politically incorrect to apply to humans. And I'm glad you brought up dogs, because I've used that example for other people before. And obviously I got called a racist and was like, oh, you're comparing humans to dogs and disgusting, horrible. It's like, yeah, okay, that's not an argument, just calling me a racist on this. It's not an argument at all, but okay. And the point which I like to use dog breeds for is when we talk about being able to breed for temperament, because obviously this comes into behavioral patterns. Are certain dog breeds more passive than others? Are certain dog breeds more aggressive than others? Yes. Can you take particularly violent dogs in a usually placid species and breed a family of particularly violent versions of that dog? Yes. Can you take a passive form of dog that's normally very aggressive and breed a more passive population? Yes.
Yeah, and it's funny.
So, for people, do you think? Put 2 and 2 together. Come on, do it.
Yeah,
and people just don't want to.
No, and it's so funny because your typical liberal who's a dog lover. I used to have a pretty big fascination with dogs, different breeds and their histories. They're more than willing to accept, average temperament of a specific breed. We know, for example, the Alaskan Malamute, which is a native dog that was bred in Alaska to do heavy labor. It tends to be bulkier than Siberian Husky and sort of cousin dog. Like it's a difficult dog to handle, but given the environment, it makes sense. Quite different from a poodle. People are more than willing to accept that. That makes sense. Environment. It's cold. It has to do hard labor. Of course it's that way, right? I don't think human beings think of themselves as apes, or even animals for that matter. I mean, your typical person thinks, well, it's, me is special or whatever. But we need to observe these things. I mean, the fact of the matter is that globally, I think, if you look at all the aid that goes to, say, sub-Saharan Africa, you could spend the next millennium doing so, and unless there are environmental changes that could bring about a kind of massive IQ shift, it's going to be for not essentially. People don't like to hear that, but that's my view.
Well, it's
So,
because in that environment you're taking away the challenge. You're taking away
yeah,
the strife that would breed greatness.
yeah.
It's if you give everything to them on a plate, it's the same reason why you can't have people living on welfare. They
Hmm.
never get themselves out of it because they never learn to become self-sufficient. They never develop those cognitive skills, the physical skills, anything like that, because they're just, they're quite happy to go and pick up their welfare check or their free bag of rice from the UN van or whatever it is. They never develop anything. There's no pressure on them, and obviously in those situations, again, it comes sort of down to breeding, and I don't like talking about breeding. Even I don't particularly like doing so when we're talking about people because I know there's going to be backlash to it.
Hmm.
But you've got to consider it like this: if you're in an environment, say somewhere where you're being given all the food that you want, no one in your population is ever going to have to grow their own food. Growing your own food requires intelligence. It requires you to be able to understand things like soil, water, basic sort of chemistry, what grows well in what soil, what grows well in what environment, crop rotation, seasonal awareness, environmental
Yeah, and
awareness. If
CS
you
is
take
pointing out.
away the need to if you take away the need for people to know that, you're basically saying all of your best and brightest are never going to have to be the best and brightest. Therefore, they're never going to demonstrate that they're the best and brightest. Therefore, they're not going to reproduce more or as much as the flaming retards because everyone's on the baseline. You've condemned your population to a lifetime of stupidity.
Well, here's a really politically incorrect thing to talk about. I've thought about for a while. I've talked to Coltrane about this. Look, if we let's accept for the time being, I think this is probably the most plausible. There's some alternative hypotheses, but let's accept that, okay, we know that we agree and we think there's so much evidence for, IQ roughly. Basically, you need to have a high IQ and be smart to, create wealth and be prosperous. Now, the average African American black IQ in the United States, 85, is a full standard deviation below the white one. Um, the conclusion there is pretty uncomfortable, in particular for the reasons you've cited. I mean, perpetual welfare, all these things. You'll get a few individuals who get out of that situation who are probably a lot smarter, and I have a number of them in my subs. But um, if on average the aggregate is at, as it say, an 85 IQ, um, I mean, there's not much that you can be done because if you compare that between the average sub-Saharan African population where there's severe nutritional deficiencies, you could make corrections there in terms of different things, food and iodine, whatever. I've mentioned this several times before. That's already been, worked out in the United States. I mean, most black people in the United States don't have nutritional deficiencies of the sort that you would encounter in sub-Saharan Africa. They also tend to have some sort of European admixture. So all those things given, there's, well, I hate to say it, but it doesn't seem like as a quote unquote community, they're well, yeah, I'll just say it, they can never get out of that situation.
Yeah, that is the uncomfortable thing. It's you just have to, and I suppose it's kind of a cruel and a bit defeatist. You do have to start coming to a point where you have to say there is only so much you can do for some people, and in some cases they're going to reach their ceiling, and their ceiling of ability is might just not be very high.
Yeah, and I mean it's funny that people more than willingly accept this for individuals. I mean, I think athletic ability is one of the most obvious ones. It's pretty obvious. You can just look at a person, like a teenage kid, and does this look like a track star or a potential professional basketball player? Pretty obvious that maybe yes or no, but you just look at the person and get a sense. People are stronger. People, I mean, it's my favorite example I've brought up in the past is weightlifting and musculature, where even structure, where muscle bellies insert, all these. It's obvious, but cognitively, people just think it's just this nebulous thing. Um, I'm not smart enough to run a central bank. I guess you could argue that maybe even the central bankers can't do it, but I accept this. I was talking about this Coltane privately a few times. There's this thing that a lot of adults learn, but maybe not all of them, and I think it has to do with a sort of stuff that your channel deals with, this sort of spoiled generation. Fucking hell, life is not fair. We all learn that we have limitations and that we're not nearly as the special snowflakes that we thought we were. Many of us have to come to the conclusion that we're not particularly remarkable. But in recognizing my own lack of being remarkable as an individual, it hasn't really adversely affected me. I still pursue the things I enjoy. I have my fun occasionally. I do the work I can do, etc. I don't, everything else is just wishful thinking to want to be something I'm not. If I can recognize that as an individual, I ask myself why, as a general trend on aggregate, that will be applied to populations, and which means that most people from the black population in the United States, they're not going to be getting PhDs in biochemistry or econometrics. Some will, but they're to the right of the bell curve, and that's what's going to happen. Now, the other, I guess, elephant in the room is, what we started the conversation with regards to how this Black Lives Matter guy was yelling at this former NYPD detective. The detective did use the word prone. Now, you can interpret prone one way or another, but...
Yeah, I'd imagine the Black Lives Matter community think that's the position people are in when they're shot by police. That's the only way they understand that word.
Yeah, I mean, there's another possibility that, maybe, I'm not saying it's definite, but maybe for a variety of reasons, not all of them just purely biological. I mean, we all know the harmful effects of single mother homes, which are very prevalent in black communities compared to others. Maybe, on average, they are more prone to commit violent crime than other genetic populations. I don't like saying that, but that is what seems to be the case if you look at the data, right? I mean, it's consistent throughout the states. So, we can ignore that. We can all feel good about ourselves, or we can start talking about it. If there is a solution to this and many other problems, because I do want to talk about problems in Europe since I'm European as well and live in Europe, we have to talk about this stuff. And maybe it's just training. I don't feel comfortable talking about it. I don't even really enjoy it that much, but I see this as a necessity to talk about these things, just as it's a necessity to talk about sex differences and the fact that, women's choices sometimes have negative effects on society and things like that. Lots of people don't want to hear that. Well, I mean, it's just not, it's not pick or choose. We got to deal with the things that are put in front of us, or we can turn away and just hope. But hope is nothing. So if there's a solution, I don't know what the solution could be, but to be honest, but we need to talk about the data and what we understand reality to be.
I'm going to segue us rather nicely here,
Okay.
because I can. Hopefully
You're
this
better
will
at
go
that
nice
than
and
I am.
smoothly.
All right.
We've covered before, people don't like talking about these topics because it becomes the gas chambers argument. It's the, once you start thinking or saying or even knowing that certain genetic populations are more likely to excel at certain things, because again, we're only talking about propensity. We're not saying absolutes, all of you genetic determinist straw men out there who fucking love throwing that phrase, and I'm sick of hearing it. Genetic determinism. No, we're talking about propensity and patterns. That is not saying must. It is simply saying some with a greater leaning towards X, Y, Z. So with the whole, it becomes the sort of gas chambers argument, when are we going to start rounding people up based on these genetic findings and exterminating them and having the Untermensch and the Übermensch again, brings us very nicely, actually, to post-Nazi Germany, because we've got that link here. It's rather interesting I don't know whether you've heard about this study, but there was one which I've heard about. I've not seen it, so I'm going to be just simply relating something which I've heard from someone else on the issue. It was someone who I can't remember which doctor it was. He was talking about again this genetic populations and the influences of culture and whatnot. It was on, I believe, Stefan Molyneux's channel. So I know you're not a huge fan of him, but you
I
might be
watch his stuff to get information, but yeah, I know
it was one of his interviews, so
right.
you might find that a bit more tolerable because it's less Stefan, more the guest speaking. I
Yeah.
personally quite enjoy him, but that's just me. But going back to it, this was a guy, and he was talking about the black population of Nazi Germany or post World War II Germany,
Mm.
and he noticed that there was a black population in Germany post World War II. Something which not a lot of people know about because
Yeah,
they
because the
seem
soldiers, the German women, typical women, they
yeah
shacked up with the victors and
yeah
they reproduced with them. Yeah.
yeah. But also, again, little known fact which people like to sweep under the rug: there were black soldiers in the Nazi Reich.
Mm.
In the same way, there were Muslim soldiers. There were Jewish soldiers in the Nazi Reich, but that's another story for another time. Obviously, there were black people in Germany at that time. And rather interestingly, the black population there had a lot less of a lower IQ or IQ
Yeah, I've heard
difference
about that
between the
actually.
white population. And this doctor hypothesized that this was obviously there was still a very slight difference, but it was a lot less. And he put it down to that there was no like ghetto thug culture like we see in a lot of the black community
It's
now.
essentially an epigenetic effect where
Yeah,
in say black like a Detroit ghetto, you're sort of getting like an IQ dampening effect where the potential outcome isn't reached because it's actively being suppressed by the environment.
yeah. Whereas in the other environment, because they were in a to use that term, which I know we don't like using, a white society, which, yeah, let's really go there, shall we? They were in a Western society, and there was none of this sort of ghetto thug, oh, we hate the police, we hate the establishment, we hate demand, now gives me that welfare check. There was none of that. It was no, you are going to be a member of society, you're going to grow up, you're going to work, you're going to get a job, you're going to have a wife, you're going to have kids, you're going to do all of this, goddammit.
Mm.
And unsurprisingly, those people sort of reached their maximum potential, which was unsurprisingly a lot closer to the surrounding population. And within a couple of generations, this sort of difference seemed to have really closed up.
Mm.
So that, in a way, sort of indicates to us that culture is a big effect on this, and we know that it is. And even when we're talking about IQ being 60 to 70% hereditary, that gives you 30 to 40% to play around with. That's not a small amount.
Well, the problem there, Teal, is that in from what I can observe in the black sort of ghetto community, it's well the same things that say CS has to deal with from Nigerians. It's if you side quote unquote with the white man, the white devil, try to live an orderly life and not be a criminal, that's frowned upon. That's seen as a sort of betrayal of the so-called black community. So there's
Mm.
kind of a friction there, but because doing the things that would maybe lead to some of these outcomes you saw in post-war World War II Germany is not something that's particularly endorsed in the black community.
Yeah.
I mean, thug life seems to be venerated to some extent for probably a variety of reasons that would go beyond the scope of this discussion. But that's the trick. I mean, that's a plausible solution, I think. But then you would have to figure out, how do you get thug culture out of those communities now? And there are all kinds of theories. One of the most prominent ones is, the whole welfare system. But as I was mentioned in the discussion with Coltrane, we can't run science experiments on these kinds of things. We can't say, hey, U.S. Senate and Congress, can we, abolish welfare in these communities for 4 decades to see what happens? That how would we do that? We can't. And I think that's a huge challenge in of itself. Um, and the same is true. I've talked to Coltrane about. I mean, the Aboriginal cultures of Australia have some of the even lower than sub-Saharan African IQs in the world. Savages stab each other all the time. But if you take one of them and put them outside, of course they tend not to be as quite as intelligent as the typical white Australian, but they're smarter, they're less savage, they don't stab everyone. So you know what can be done there? Well, for one thing, and I think another tricky issue. This whole politically correct garbage about sort of Aboriginal or Native cultures and how they're to be venerated. I mean, on average, these cultures, even compared to, say, Europe 400 years ago, were just far more violent, these cultures. And we're talking about scalping people. And I was talking to CS about cannibalism in Nigeria and how certain tribes would torture people to death, and still do to varying degrees, and then apply palm oil enemas onto corpses to make them more succulent for the purposes of consumption. Um, there's nothing glorious or great, in my view, about Aboriginal culture. And I'm not specifically talking about Australia, but primitive cultures. They keep people in a perpetual state of stupidity. They keep them savage and violent, and that's not politically correct to say. But I mean, and particularly in Australia, this seems to be a huge issue. You daren't not criticize. You daren't criticize the Aboriginal cultures there, and same with Native American culture in the United States or in Canada. And these cultures were primitive cultures that were less advanced, even when the European colonizers arguably were less violent than some of these. I mean, when Cortez conquered much of Mexico, observing the Aztecs. I mean, yeah, there was the Inquisition, all these horrible things, and yet they still weren't cutting people's hearts out and engaging in cannibalism. So we need to get to the point where we can firstly say, like, that's not good. Savage culture, it had its time. It should be over for most people. Everyone will benefit from appreciating modern human civilization. And the same applies, I think, to a lesser degree. Obviously, ghetto black thug culture isn't of the same caliber as, pumping people with palm oil enemas to consume them. But that is an inferior culture to mainstream society where people aren't gang banging and killing people and having half a dozen children from 5 different fathers. And that's an inferior way of living if you are concerned about things like intelligence and cohesion and all of these things. You can't even get on national television and say that, because that in itself is it's controversial to say that savage Aboriginal cultures, which you name it, they did everything pretty much violent you could imagine, that those are inferior to modern civilizations and cultures. It baffles me, but yeah, that statement itself is something that you cannot say in a public sphere, which is shocking, I think.
Yeah, the noble savage myth, I think, is one of the most damaging myths that we have that still exists. This idea that wanting to have people not engage in acts of cannibalism is imperialism or colonialism and therefore wrong.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, what? It's like, yes, are we trying to say that Western culture is perfect? Not by a long shot. We know it's got a lot of problems. However, we're not eating each other. We're not sticking each other in tires, dousing them with gasoline and setting them on fire.
Yeah. That, by the way, neclacine has its own Wikipedia article in case anyone's interested. It's that common in Africa. So.
Oh God, yeah, but no, Africa is so enlightened, such a noble, savage culture that they are. You can't tell them that that's wrong because reasons or something. I don't know.
And no matter where you are, I think it's particularly virulent in North America and in Australia that criticizing Aboriginal culture is just, you don't do it. It can cost you your job if you make public statements to that effect. But it's not too dissimilar in being critical of say black thug life. And look, it's a funny thing is I used to listen to rap music when I was younger, like NWA, and they all got out of the ghetto. They didn't want to stay there. Uh, and of course, you're not allowed to say that either as a person who's not black, because reasons. But that to me seems probably the most plausible scenario. I mean, giving up essentially thug culture, which is just a non-productive waste, and probably does have that sort of IQ dampening effect. Um, it can't be good. I think anyone can. Most people acknowledge it's not, wholesome, but nobody wants to talk about it. And when black people talk about it, they're called crackers or whatever. Sorry, Uncle Toms. No, we're crackers, stupid crackers. But it's insane. Now, moving to Europe, it's not entirely dissimilar, and I think part of the issue is that once again, we have genetic populations that, by and large, don't really want to assimilate. Increasingly, they have their own sort of enclaves. They do their own thing. They have their own cultural practices. In many cases, they don't speak the language. I've seen this many times. A bank teller that I'll have to just resort to hands and pointing to explain to some woman in a Muslim scarf or what have you, and how to operate something like an ATM. They don't even understand English half the time, so he can't even do that. Um, that's a problem. And then you don't know what goes on in these communities, and probably there's some degree of inbreeding. We know there's inbreeding in the Pakistani Kashmiri community in the UK, in areas like Birmingham. So presumably you'd have the same to some degree in North African enclaves. They have their own society, their own quote-unquote judges. How could people expect these outcomes that we've been seeing recently? Driving lorries into people, attacking people with axes. I mean, this guy was actually just the Afghani teenager. He was just a quote-unquote asylum seeker. I don't know how people can expect a different outcome. And nobody in Europe has the balls to say no. Now, I don't think I don't think these enclaves are good, and they produce, generally speaking, bad people that are ill-suited to European culture. I'm not saying that all European culture is the same, but the general trend in Europe is to, live peacefully, do your own thing, and just sort of get along and not obsess about religion and all this other crap. They tend to have issues with that. So I don't, they kind of, in my view, need to get with the program or get out. And people don't like hearing that either, but that's my view.
Yeah, well, you and I have spoken about this before, the concept of cultural unilateralism, the
Yeah.
idea that in order for an area to succeed, you have to have basically one culture. Like, you can't spend your entire time with this constant, and it's been objectively shown when you have different cultures all operating in one area, the lack of trust, the general sense of paranoia that always goes along with it, because you always get increased crime, you always get increased antisocial behavior, increased costs. Just everything is damaged by the existence of multi-cultures in one particular area. You can have different cultures as long as they're kind of similar, in the same way that throughout areas of Europe. I mean, this is something that just any European country, obviously your culture does change very slightly
Oh yeah.
every few miles. There's
Yeah.
sort of slightly different local customs, but generally they're all coming from the same basic area.
Mm.
So you don't get nearly as much friction unless it comes from, artificial in-group, out-group with, stupid teenage gang culture or some other form of mental handicap like that.
Mm.
So if we could sort of get into an area where we could actually say to people, hey, we need to have one culture. We can't continue this forcing lots of different ideas to exist in one place. And then I suppose we get to one of my bigger problems with European culture as it exists. And it's basically the main sort of bugbear that I have with liberalism. And it's the whole individualism thing. Now, I like the concept of the individual. I like treating people like individuals. I like assessing people on individual merits, on individual bases. That's the best way of doing things. However, when the individual becomes the absolute apex of your culture, you basically end up again with what's happening now. People isolate themselves from each other, and they end up sort of mistrusting each other or not knowing each other, and in this kind of rampant materialist pursuit. It's always, oh, you got to keep up with the Joneses or the Smiths. You've got to spend all your money and have all of these. Oh, what's the name of the? What's the economic principle of it? Veblen goods. You've got to have all of that sort of stuff. The needlessly expensive things that show your status, even though they're actively harmful to your bank balance because social standing. When you lose any sense of community or any sense of togetherness, that becomes just as harmful. And like I said, I like the idea of taking people as individuals and thinking of people as individuals, assessing them as individuals. That's great. But you do have to have some sort of collective sense of community. Because without that, people aren't going to be thinking, how are my actions going to affect other people? How can I make other people's lives better as well as my own? And it all becomes a kind of selfish cash grab, me, which is from this. It is sort of one of those unfortunate sort of side effects of this of an individualist style capitalist system like this. People do begin only thinking of how much wealth can I get and fuck everyone
Well,
else.
yeah, and I suppose one of the alt-right's arguments, I mean, they would agree with you, I suspect. They would say, that's, too much capital is bad. Most of them want welfare for quote unquote white people, a socialist system. And they would argue that, so they use the term race, but say genetics is, inextricably linked to culture. And the only way you can have a community and care about a community is, well, if everyone's pretty much homogenous and the same, more or less. As you pointed out, slight differences, but more or less. There might be, I mean, look, and there was that Putnam study that one of the guys, I Slay Pretty Lies, talked about. This guy, I think his name is Robert Putnam. His last name is Putnam in any event. He did some interesting research and sat on it for the better part of a decade because the results didn't really jive with what he wanted. But it seemed that the more diversity you get, the more you get the so-called turtling effect, where people just kind of go off and do their own thing and don't really communicate. But I've been thinking about this quite a bit, and I don't think it's as black and white as that. I think there are other elements. Now, I was going to make maybe a separate video on this, but well, why not just talk about it here? Because I think it's interesting. You take a friend of mine like Coltrane. I don't really have much contact with my neighbors apart from, hello, goodbye. Yeah, standard, modern. That's what it's like these days in Europe and presumably in many parts of the States. But there's an effect that technology has had, the internet, for example, on the world, the globe. And it's really changed things quite a bit, I think. So I take my friend Coltane. Well, he's not my neighbor in a physical sense. The guy is thousands and thousands of kilometers away. But given the strange time traveling nature of his location and mine, generally when I'm about to start my work day or on a work break, he comes home from work or he's in his evening time, and we'll have a chat or whatever, and we talk like like neighbors. So there's a kind of new dimension of social interaction, which isn't necessarily reflective, and I guess this is a bit off topic of, the sort of community thing that you might be talking about, but nonetheless is a kind of new dimension to social cohesion. It's just that maybe in many cases, I know in my case or Coltane's case, maybe he just would prefer to talk to someone, halfway across the globe as a neighbor rather than his actual neighbor, because his actual neighbor is a guy he has nothing in common with, for example. I mean, I certainly see their side of the art, or that side of the argument that you presented, but I also see that technology has created new options. Now, we are kind of going a little off topic, because I do believe in, say European culture. I consider myself, well, I am, by every definition of the word, European. I appreciate the history and the languages and all of that. And I think it's something worth defending. I don't want to see European culture become, resemble Saudi Arabia or what have you. But there are some other elements that further complicate things, and I don't think it's just individualism. I think it's also the effects of an expanding social technology, which is effectively what the internet is. I mean, how could we have this conversation we're having now were it not for literally, well, it's not transcontinental in our case, but I mean, across the channel we're having this conversation. That's pretty incredible. And yet we're having an interesting, productive conversation despite not being physical neighbors. So there's another dimension there, and maybe I'll make a video expanding on this more with more research. It's just that, yeah, it's a bit complicated. But certainly, as far as European culture is concerned, I'm a staunch advocate for it. I appreciate everything that it's produced and given me. And I think, by and large, despite its many tribulations and the mistakes it's made and continues to make occasionally, it's produced some pretty damn good outcomes. And there's a reason people, frankly speaking, from shitholes in the world want to come here. But if they're not willing to give up the shithole mentality, that's a problem. Yeah. Sorry,
Yeah.
it's very
Yeah, no.
long.
No, but it is a very interesting thing to consider, the idea that we can expand sort of social horizons through technology. I mean, I know that is very off topic, so I'm not going to particularly say anything about it.
It
I
is an
think
interesting
that's
topic in its own right. I think you'd agree. Yeah.
Yeah, that's something which I think deserves either a presentation or a conversation
I'll
in
probably
its own,
end up making
in
a
its own
video on
right.
it. Yeah.
So I'm not going to go on to that. I'm going to drag us back
Right.
onto
Yes. You're good at that. Yeah.
shall we discuss? I suppose we have to, because our neighbours, after all, I suppose more in your neck of the woods, as it were, have been responsible for some of the latest happenings regarding the religion of peace in and around Europe.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we don't, as I mentioned probably at the beginning, the latest thing is in Munich. A guy with some psychosis or something along those lines shot and killed a bunch of people in McDonald's, including children. He was the son of Iranian asylum seekers. And then shortly before that, most people know there was in the same region, the same state, Bavaria, a guy who is not really clear whether he was an Afghan or Pakistani. In any event, he got onto a train with a knife and an axe. I have no idea how he got access to an axe, but whatever. And shouted Allahu Akbar and proceeded to chop people up. Nobody died, some severe injuries, but he was shot dead by the police. And these kinds of palpapism, or rather, these are paroxysms that we've seen, palpitations, if you will. They're becoming more and more frequent. Crowd and T made a pretty good video about this, without going to say some of this genetic stuff, but just this is becoming sort of the new standard of living in Europe. Frequently, lone wolves just having, whether they're directly motivated by ISIS or just having some psychotic episode, just doing crazy shit that really wasn't that commonplace 20 plus years ago. It's only been recent, and particularly with the lone wolf thing, even more recent, last 5 years or so. Germany, yeah, I think it's another matter of time until the next big thing happens. Interestingly enough, it seems that a lot of the carnage that occurred in Cologne on New Year's Eve, well, there was a fair bit of cover-up. There were more, I guess, violations than had been reported. Similarly, in Paris, the worst attack, where all those people were taken hostage and killed, apparently before they killed them, they castrated the men and shoved knives up the women's vaginas, but the French government tried to cover that up. So, yeah, this is. I don't see why it's very clear that we should have a zero tolerance policy for that. And by that I mean, I don't just mean sort of the politicians' line. Yeah, let's just we can't tolerate it. We really need to critically examine Islam. Yeah, the religion. things that it finds permissible, and it's still a sacred cow. And I know why, because everyone's afraid. I mean, politicians are afraid because it's not the religion of peace, because everyone is afraid that they're going to get stabbed to death or shot or whatever. This is, but once again, you can spread the risk. I think if millions of people across Europe talked about the problem of Islam, and frankly speaking, that in as much as Islam represents a sort of repugnant ideology, it's essentially medievalism. It's that mentality, like when the doctor tells the Pakistani woman in the UK that, well, your stillbirth and your daughter with the neurological disorder that's going to cripple her for life, that's because you fucked and bred with your first cousin. Says, oh, just the will of God. That's medievalism, and I think we should have a zero tolerance policy towards medievalism, in as much as Islam in its totality is by and large a product of the early Middle Ages, and we've more or less overcome that in Europe. We can't tolerate that, so we need to talk about these things without fear, and without the politically correct police coming in and saying, well, religion of peace or whatever. I think people are scared. People don't. Here's another thing, and I see your point here. If you didn't explicitly mention this, but sorry, I'm talking quite a bit here, but um, people just want to get on with their lives in some sense, and so they don't want to take the time and energy to look at this stuff. They want to go to work or run their business or fuck their wife or whatever. They don't want to think about this stuff, but it's accumulating. It's like trash in a river. It's piling up, and it's getting worse and worse. And we need to talk about it. Lots of people need to talk about it, and it's not even that this isn't enjoyable to talk about. I'd rather be talking about Overwatch. Well, it can be depressing too, but it needs to be talked about, and people just want to get on with their lives. They have to realize that they're going to have to take some stance on this issue as it becomes ever more important as time goes on. I've said that I have no problem repeating myself. I don't want Islam in Europe. I would prefer Islam just not be in Europe at all, even made illegal. I don't want it here. It doesn't belong here. It's not part of the culture. If people want to do their Islamic stuff, they can do it in Islamic countries. In this respect, I feel very much European, despite my atomized individualism. But yeah, I appreciate European culture, and it's not part of European culture, and it's destructive to any culture. So I don't want Islam here. That stance is something that you're probably not going to hear from politicians, but maybe some consideration of the destructive tendencies of this religion would be appreciated in the public sphere. So I'll stop talking now. I've talked a lot.
No, but it's a completely reasonable point to raise. It is that wherever Islam goes, it causes problems with whatever society it comes in contact with, always, without fail. The idea that we can just ignore that is, frankly, an absurdity. The whole issue around the Islam problem, and I have no problem with calling it a problem because it's a bloody problem, is that we have people like us who are saying, no, it's an us versus them, because it is. And then we have other people in Western society, all of the tolerant, look at me, I'm so progressive virtue signalers saying, no, it's not an us and them, not all Muslims, da-da-da-da-da, we have to get on with everyone. So, okay, you can have that opinion, but to them, we're the outgroup, unavoidably. They see us in this light. Therefore, the only thing we can do is return with that viewpoint. Because otherwise, you're basically just holding open the door and saying, come on in and fucking destroy everything that we hold dear.
And this is
because that is their aim.
Yeah.
That's what they want.
Yeah. I mean, as much as I'm accused of atomism and atomized individualism, and I am very atomized, I did grow up with a pretty deep reverence of European culture. My father was born in Hungary. The first trips I took were to Europe. I spent, just through traveling so much of my childhood in Europe, and I've been living all my adult life in Europe. I just, I think European culture is worth defending. It's a great thing. I'm very much a product of it. and so is the United States, the country I was born. I don't understand how someone can get so atomized where they lose track of something like that, and more importantly, the fact that I love the not all are like that because yeah, fair enough. I mean, what modern European these days? I was just thinking about this because one of my subs sent me this link to a pretty gruesome image of some Syrians. I don't know if they're ISIS or not, literally sawing off the head of a Palestinian boy, who's another brown-skinned person, by the way. So interestingly enough, not a decapitation, but the guy just hacking away until the thing fell off, and then he holds it up by the head. Now, I'm convinced that most Muslims aren't like that. But what modern European in this day and age engages in that type of behavior? Vanishingly few to none. So that in itself is a problem when you have any manifestation of that type of behavior in that particular culture and religion, and where you have to say, well, no, most aren't like that. Of course, most aren't like that, but it's a sign and a symbol of the backwardness of Islamic culture that sort of thing is still exists. Whereas at least a few centuries ago, we kind of got over that level of brutality. Maybe even 3, I don't know. But we made progress, and they haven't. This is a black and white issue. I have, no problem if people do this stuff in their countries. If they want to, have sex with their first cousins and have, mentally retarded children who have health problems, let them do it if it's the will of God. But not at the taxpayer's dime or cent or whatever in Europe. And these practices, they don't have a place here. The Habsburgs tried it, didn't work out too well with them, inbreeding. We've made a lot of progress in Europe in the last few centuries, and it's been hard fought for. And tens and millions of people, specifically tens of millions of men, died for I guess the dying echoes of the vanity of strange human ambition, say primarily in the world wars, turning our back on that so we can just give it all up. I don't think they just don't realize what they would be giving up, and it's hard to impress that upon them. Maybe they don't study history. I don't know, but Islam is not a friend. I mean, they make nice for the time being, but given sufficient numbers, we have so much evidence. It's such a frustrating topic that people just can't get on board with just saying no, Islam not good for Europe. Don't want it in Europe. Keep it out of Europe. There are practical problems there. There are now a lot of Muslims in Europe, and I mean, I don't know. Pay them to leave? I have no idea, but that's my stance.
Yeah, I've spoken about this before. I think it was with you. When it comes to Islam, Islam is not only a religion. This is the big thing that people seem to just still not be getting. Islam is a legal system. Islam is a financial system.
Yeah, it's even a
Islam
reproductive
is a
culture.
way of running a country. Yeah, Islam is a definition of how you do everything. It is how you run your society. It's how you run your banks. It's how you run your families. It's how you run your courts. And then it's also who you get on your knees and talk to every evening or 5 times a day or however ridiculously it is. It's all the other shit that's the problem. If it was just every so often you go and talk to your imaginary sky friend, it wouldn't be a problem. The problem is all the other things that Islam is. And that's the thing that people are not willing to address.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and I think, as I said earlier, a lot of this just to do with people just want to get on with their lives and realizing that, like it or not, we exist now in a state of conflict. People who want to preserve certain Western values, and my big thing is I just want to be left alone. But Islam doesn't do that. It doesn't leave you alone. Infidels will be the first to go.
The closest you can get is having to pay the tithe that I can't remember what they call it.
You can't pay a tithe as an atheist. I mean,
I believe you
can. Okay. I didn't know that.
There's a thing in Islam. I don't know whether it applies to non-believers in total, But there is a thing where if you're not an Islamist, or if you're not a Muslim, or if you don't believe in Allah or
Or
any of
you're
that
not
sort
a
of stuff,
Christian or a Jew, etc., etc.
yeah, that you can, if you're living in an Islamic state, you can pay like effectively a state fine of however many 100 units of currency to the
Yeah.
government for
Okay.
them to
I still
like
wouldn't be able to
not
say what I
prosecute.
want, and
No, no,
and
no, you couldn't. But there, I can't remember what the name of it is. But it's basically like an I'm. It's basically an I'm an infidel tithe that you pay. It's like, yeah, I'm going to pay you to not execute me for not believing in your God, sort of thing.
yeah,
I don't know how that applies to atheism or how exactly it's enacted, but I have heard that there is a thing like that in Islam, which again further entrenches Islam is not just a religion.
yeah, and yeah, yeah, yeah. I just it's difficult to get people on board with this. Especially you have the younger spoiled generation, but I guess older people don't even quite understand what's going on. And I was talking to my parents the other day, and they just they had different issues when they were growing up, but political and all that other stuff. It's just they don't really understand what's going on in the world. But I think the current course is such that we're going to be dealing with this increasingly. More axing, stabbings, guns, all that great stuff. I don't really mean great, obviously, but continually for perhaps years to come. I
That seems to be the position
because
of
the
what was that French politician who actually said that we just have to get used to it.
yeah,
What kind of
and
politician fucking says that to their electorate? You elected me into a position of power because you trust me. You're just going to have to tolerate those people raping and murdering you.
yeah,
What kind
yeah.
of fucking leader are you?
Another lorry plowed in 100 people. Well, yeah, that these lorries they fly off a handle every now and then. You just need one agitated North African to do so. But well, yeah, the current politicians, the worthless politicians we have, um, But what's the alternative? The alternative is the things you offered. I mean, if you were to screen people and select people out of these communities, which I think unfortunately you have to do, that's viewed as a kind of Nazism and being and practicing a kind of you're picking on them and they have to be picked on. They're fucking Muslims, and a lot of them, as I mentioned before many times, even if they don't promote this sort of active form of the ideology, they're passive. They don't mind the jihadists and the crazies ramming trucks into people. It's just oh whatever. It doesn't really matter. Yes, I know other Muslims were killed in the Nice accident, but neither here nor there. If anything, that should be an indication to Muslims that they need to either stop being Muslims or quote unquote reform. Now, I do want to briefly talk about this whole notion of reforming Islam. I've thought about this for a while, and we just don't have the time. We're all going to be dead in 300 years, presumably, almost certainly. We don't have to 300 or 400 years to wait for Islam to try to fix itself. And I honestly don't even think it's a responsibility of Europeans to deal with, to fix Islam. Why should we have to do this? I mean, they should, if they come to Europe, they should appreciate European culture and not want to, blow people up and stab people and ram trucks into people. I don't know why we have to brook that. If they want to, if they need to deal with their own reformation, let them do it in their own countries. I guess that's what ISIS and all that other crap going on there is. It's pretty bloody and brutal, but I don't understand why we can't just in this particular case have a zero tolerance policy. Um, because it's just so destructive and it's getting worse and worse. And a politician, I actually hadn't heard that till there. A politician went on television and said, "Well, you just have to let's get used to stabbings and axings and just lots of crazy shit." And the most recent incident probably wasn't an Islamist, although I mean it might have been religiously motivated, just some psychotic guy with who obviously was not properly assimilated. You know. This is all these politically incorrect things we've talked about need to be examined. It seems like we're the water is beginning to boil, whether it's in the United States and Europe, although slight for somewhat different reasons. And if we don't start addressing this directly and talk about the data and the facts, and consequently possible solutions, although that could come a bit later, we possibly could kiss this all goodbye. Just because I hate to admit it, I don't think we can get rid of Islam anymore in any reasonable way. Their Muslims are everywhere. They don't consider themselves Europeans. They if you talk to them, they're Muslims, right? They don't. I mean, say what you want about civic nationalism, and a lot of people criticize, particularly alt-right, but most Muslims don't even consider themselves British people. They consider themselves Muslims, and then they're British, and then they're whatever, I don't know, something else. Well, they certainly don't consider themselves European. I don't. I'm worried because I do care about European culture. I don't, I don't want to hear about these other things. I don't, if I'm in a fairly decent sized city, I don't want something like that happening to me or people around me. It's insane. And yeah, and then of course the so-called far right. After this happened in France, you can bet your bottom dollar that people like Marine Le Pen were, in some almost sadistically happy about it because it's going to increase their chances of getting elected. I don't know. Maybe that's what's necessary. I don't know because nobody else is talking about this stuff. Only these far right nationalists, and this is of course the problem. Something that Sam Harris talks about. He's got a much more tolerant opinion towards Islam, but I just think zero tolerance. I mean, if you want to live in Europe, you can do that, and you can be a European, but you got to give up Islam. That's my view.
Yeah, I would agree, and I would agree because I don't think Islam can be reformed for the simple reason that, as I've laid out, Islam is more than a religion. It's more than talking to your imaginary friend. It has so much other stuff in it. And frankly, if you're not doing that stuff, then you're not actually a proper Muslim. It's like saying, like, oh, if you want to, you can be a reformed Muslim, you just have to ignore this half of your religion. Well, you're not really following the religion then, are you? So to be a Muslim is to be all of these things that we are seeing, and it is inescapable. It's inseparable. Unless you rewrite the Quran, unless you actually have a Muslim renaissance, that sort of level of, we're going to burn this and rewrite it, it's not going to happen. It's going to be an impossibility.
Yeah. Well, reform or not, the reform would take probably centuries, or at the very least decades and decades. By that time, the landscape of Europe will have been permanently changed, and that's something I would prefer not to see. I mean, Europe has been through so much crap for centuries, and they have to deal with this. Everyone thought everything had sort of been settled. Like, okay, we'll just get on with our lives now, and now we have this new crap to deal with. So, it's
the lefty snowball that happens. It's this is one thing I can't stand about the political left. It's the further left you go, everyone just keeps becoming more and more left, and it becomes a fucking one-upsmanship contest. I'm more progressive and leftist than you.
I don't understand what
just
motivates these people. I mean, it's alien to me. I don't understand. I don't really have a particular political bent one way or another. I just look at each issue, but I just don't. These people are alien to me. It's why, by and large, I just ignore people who say, "Oh, you're a scientific racist," or "You're this and that." These people don't even have arguments based on actual information and data. Why
are you going to talk about the data, or are you going to just call me a label and say, well, that's it, I won the internet?
Well, for the time being, TLDR, the labeling, the label calling, the name calling still works to some degree. Like when that Black Lives Matter guy shouted down the police officer, implying that he was a racist and all this stuff. I mean, that still works because that's the current cultural trend, unfortunately. But I get the feeling that people are tired of it, slowly but surely. I mean, very few people are willing to talk about these things in the depth we have. I mean, I had kind of a lukewarm feeling about people like Sargon because I feel like he's a sort of fence sitter. And I feel when it comes to these issues that as soon as it does become politically sanctioned to talk about, say, IQ, he'll talk about it. But until then, hold off.
Yeah,
But
we've seen this in the anti-feminist crowd
yeah,
before.
yeah, absolutely.
Even regarding things like human nature and mate preference.
Uh,
I'm just going to call it mate preference.
right.
Read hypergamy, but mate preference in general. For them, it's you can talk about male mate preference and what men find attractive on aggregate throughout the species. Can't do that for women though, because that's not been sanctioned yet as one of the things that we're allowed to talk about. So
Yeah, yeah.
that's it. I'm sick of this. It's the middle ground has become the new high ground.
Yeah,
I
I see
must
that.
sit on this fence until someone else tells me what to think.
And that's why I see so many in the anti-feminist camp. I've participated occasionally in some of these Google Hangouts, and I've listened to them, and it's a kind of a fence-sitting circle jerk. I don't find them particularly informative or interesting. We need people that actually talk about and tackle some of these hard issues. And I don't really like the alt-right, but they're the only group talking about at least some of this. They tend to ignore things about the female nature, but every group has its sort of thing that they don't want to talk about, I guess. I want to just be able to talk about everything in equal terms and
I
without.
think that's because the alt right is very big on the race thing and
Oh
the
yeah, it's a
whole
reproductive. I've said it's a reproductive movement. They need
yeah, and
the quote unquote
addressing
white women.
female nature would put them off that, I
Well,
think.
it's interesting. But this was years ago. Barbarossa read some stuff off about how it's off-putting to women to the alt-right because they sound like quote unquote wounded soldiers. So it's not my problem. I'll talk about women or genetics, genetic populations or whatever. But the fence sitting thing is really annoying because these are people with huge platforms. I'm a pretty small channel. I'm 20,000 subs at the moment. Um, Maybe they have huge platforms because they're fence sitters. Probably, but that we need to make a breakthrough there because only if enough voices talk about all of these issues, take your pick, uh, genetic differences between people, IQ differences, sex differences, the problem, and it is a problem of Islam. Then it will slowly become more acceptable, at least to talk about in the open. But right now it's all hushed, hushed, and it's just incredible. It's so destructive. I just don't understand that mentality. But I guess I'm a weirdo. But it's no, I'm pretty frustrated because the more people investigate the stuff, the more potentially accurate the conclusions we could come to about all these issues, because we could have more minds drawing their attention to those issues rather than a few people investigating and looking at these things. So it's really frustrating. But I think most people, at least in my audience, who've stuck with me through the years, realize that ultimately my channel is about human exploration, and we have to take into consideration things that don't make us feel good, that are unpleasant, but nonetheless need to be addressed. That's not a smear on any individual person. Just that's what we need to do. I think as a civilization, but we are a long, long way from that. And well, one of my big gripes is the fence sitters. But maybe one day whenever it becomes politically sanctioned, we can talk about this other stuff. Until then, I have no idea. Those are my closing thoughts, I think.
Yeah, that's. I'm happy to end sort of there. I'd like to quickly sort of talk about this kind of new internet academia, I suppose, is a kind of little segue from that just quickly. When the internet sort of came out, it was kind of this tool, and everyone was really excited about, like, oh, think about all the research and things that we can do. We can pool the knowledge of all people into this place, and we can assemble all of this knowledge, and we can examine anything and everything to our heart's content. And yet we still don't do that. And even worse, we're now in a
Oh,
situation
dude, I've been
where
thinking about
it's
that for years.
yeah, and we're now in this situation where it's if some random person on the internet is like, hey, I found all of this stuff and it forms a pattern and it's really interesting. It's like, yeah, we're not going to listen to you because you're clearly a crackpot or a nut job. You're not someone in academia. You're not writing for a scientific journal or anything like that. or you wrote it on Wikipedia or read it on Wikipedia, therefore your opinion is dismissed. It's really bizarre that this idea that this tool that we were supposed to have, this, this glorious internet of knowledge, this ability to pool everything that we've all known, experienced, observed, to cross-reference all of everything that we've ever known throughout our lives, and yet this new frontier of exploration of knowledge has basically pushed people further into academic traditionalism. If it's not in a peer-reviewed journal, it's wrong. If it didn't come out of academia, it's not worth investigating.
Well, let's be frank. What seems to be par for the course on the internet, what seems to be sort of the meat and potatoes, as it were, I mean, like your typical popular YouTube channel, like Drama Alert, or for women, the July Haul, which is a reference to like some sort of clothing shopping spree. Or people, the internet is a reflection of, well, generally speaking, people's ignorance, lack of intellectual curiosity, because that's what most people are. They're ignorant and not particularly intellectually curious. And so, despite all of this knowledge at their fingertips, it's it doesn't really surprise me ultimately when I think about it. Initially, it did, but it's reminds me of a scene from the film Seven, where Morgan Freeman's playing Detective Somerset. He's in this library doing research, and he tells the guards there, or all this, knowledge at your fingertips, and what do? You sit around listening to music and play poker. Well, he can't really grasp it either. But I think that it's only the intellectually curious who find that really puzzling. I find myself just, there's just too much information sometimes, and it's just, But yeah, I think the internet, like anything, is a social reflection of humans' tendencies, and people just aren't really that keen on understanding stuff. I mean, you know what it's like. People on your channel vastly prefer a Lacy Green takedown to a meticulous sort of scientific video, right?
Yeah, which is really rather sad, actually. This is why I'm sort of trying to move more towards, like, hey, here's a piece of research, let's look at it, and then I'll try and link it to something that's happening that you might be interested in. Because I find the research more interesting. I'm hoping to kind of drag people into that, and it seems to be working slowly, gradually.
Yeah. I think slight tugging might work, but I don't see anything great changing anytime soon, at least in that regard. But those are.
One day we'll get there. I'm glad that we're able to sort of get these little conversations out, though, because I think these are kind of the more interesting things that I sort of get to point people to from my channel. It's kind of like, look, we're going to look at often some really weird hypothetical stuff over here. This is kind of like, the testing ground, as it were, for all of these ideas.
I'm the guinea pig for the extreme of the politically incorrect, and I don't mind. I mean, I think it's important, and I don't think political incorrectness for the sake of political incorrectness is particularly valuable. It's just that a lot of the things that I like to talk about or think are important are just they fall into that category. So what am I to do?
Yeah, well, I'm more than happy to explore all of these ideas because, as I believe I've said before, social justice and feminists and this ultra-leftist nonsense that we're seeing now is all this, black people as a group, white people as a group, everyone experiences this, and this. It's like, okay, well, can we objectively show from, like, a scientific or a medical thing, that black people do need this help as a group because of genetic differences or intelligence differences? Let's prove it objectively. If we can prove it objectively, I will happily, start providing affirmative action and suitable jobs and all of that stuff if you can objectively prove that it's needed. For now, you haven't, because you're too busy calling me a racist when I try and prove it. Or just when I try and test it. I'm going to say test, because when I say prove, that sounds like I'm pushing an agenda. No, the scientific definition of prove to test. For all the little fucking semantic nitpick quote miners out there.
Yeah. No, I agree. It's something something
I'm
that
sick of having to clarify everything like that. Just any time you want to say anything, you just always have to put these little fucking placating. Some people this thing and that and some and kind of and most.
I call it qualifying. You have to, I'm not a racist, but I think I've gotten better at not doing that. Not the classic one is, obviously there's some women that don't fall within this paradigm, but qualifying everything. You kind of need, I guess, in a politically correct atmosphere, even the internet, you need to do that to some degree, because if you don't, then they can always throw that at you.
And it always becomes that fantastic fucking straw man argument. It was like, oh, so you think this? It's like, no.
Rest assured, we will be called racists and Islamophobes after this conversation. I have almost no doubt. But
I've just taken to owning it. It's like people have said, "Oh, you're anti-Islam." I'm like, yes.
Yeah.
After that, they can't say anything. Oh, so you're a bigot? Yes.
We's racists and shit,
Yeah.
So it's gotta. We have to have these conversations, and unfortunately, it doesn't. Some people don't feel comfortable. I mean, I guess they can do the sort of no see, no hear, the whole monkey thing, where you cover up all the orifices on your face. Well, fair enough, but I don't know. It's not for me.
That is the best way of not noticing the truck that's plowing.
Well, right, but that's what most Europeans these days, and I think most Americans, people, they just don't want to think about this stuff. They just want to get on with their lives, and yet increasingly it's going to become more and more difficult for all of us to get on with our lives if we have to deal with new security measures, worrying about when the next AK-47 rattle is going to go off, or a bomb. The fact in the United States, I mean, this is, people think for some reason that the police are maliciously out to get black people. That's absurd, but people think that. A lot of people think that these days. I mean, there are some serious problems here. I mean, the police they're a major component of the government and interaction between the state and its people and the people. So these are huge hurdles we have to overcome, and you can't overcome them through obfuscation like Black Lives Matter, or the police are racist and we's racists, and it doesn't solve anything. So I've proposed a few solutions, but I don't know how great they are, and I doubt most people would listen to them. So on that note, I think we've had an interesting and lengthy conversation. I will, close up my thoughts there. Any final thoughts, or?
No, just other than if we want to explore some extra possibilities of these things in finally getting around to making Wonka Donka great again.
Oh yeah,
at another date.
Yeah, I'd love to get CS on that as well. But yeah, Wonka Donk, the nation of Wonka Donk could be a very interesting thought experiment. And by the way, I will eventually be releasing a video, I think, on this idea of expanding social circles via the internet. I've thought a lot about it and how it's created like new stratification, different aspects of society. But yeah, that's a separate topic. So everyone, thanks for tuning in. And as most of you know, everyone knows, this is Teal Deer, the legendary turquoise aquamarine. I don't know. I guess I don't even know what color you are.
The clue is in the name.
Yeah.
Say what you see.
Teal. Yeah, sorry. It's all different. Teal Deer. And we'll check you out quite soon, in all likelihood. Thanks for tuning in, and you take care. Bye-bye. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.